Hello, and welcome to Outside the Wall, a podcast on movie and TV discussion. I am one of three co hosts, Wallenstein, joined by X Death and Rame.
Hello.
Hello.
And today's episode, we are talking about Oliver Stone's 1987 Wall Street. This was actually a film that I had recommended sort of at the last minute when I found out we were watching American Psycho, because I know these two films tend to pair well together because they both are kind of critiquing American capitalism and consumer culture of particularly the 80s when both these films take place. So this is a story of a young kind of up and coming stockbroker named Bud Fox, played by Charlie Sheen, who is trying to make it big, in other words, and get out of his kind of daily grind that his current job is and become big and famous, and winds up running into a very unscrupulous investor bigwig named Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas. And throughout the film, Bud kind of becomes his protege, winds up getting the good-looking girlfriend, the nice penthouse, the fancy cars, and everything, and then winds up realizing what it has cost him and turns the tables on Gordon Gekko and winds up exposing Gekko for insider trading. And the film also kind of ends ambiguously, similar to how our previous film American Psycho did. But this being an Oliver Stone film, kind of know what you're getting as far as what the themes are going to be or what kind of outlying critiques or satire it's going to be. And I'll leave that for further discussion. So that's it.
Okay, I'll go next. So I like this movie pretty well. I think it has a fairly, even though it's a little on the longer side, it has a pretty good pace, and it does a good job making scenes about just people calling people on the phones and doing stock trading engaging. It's interesting to see how the stockbrokers kind of create the phenomenon of a certain stock rising and then falling and manage to profit out of it without actually contributing anything of value towards society, as Oliver Stone probably wants us to think. Yeah, we can make the comparison between this one and Crime and Punishment again, which we did with American Psycho, where it has this theme of the potential sort of spiritual benefits of having to face the music for your actions, with our hero in this movie eventually going to jail, or probably going to jail anyways. Otherwise, though, it does follow a little bit of the tried and true movie tropes with the love interest and things like that. The rich guy turns out to be the bad guy, all of that sort of thing, and it's a kind of a typical big ego rise and fall sort of story too for Gordon Gekko. So yeah, overall pretty engaging, watchable, decent film. Make this point not probably going to be anybody's favorite. That's all I'll say.
So I also enjoyed this film, though I think the last act could have been executed better. And Evil X makes the comparison with Crime and Punishment. I think I could make a bit of a mention of another Russian American author, Ayn Rand, and Fountainhead. What he mentioned about the stockbrokers apparently contributing nothing to society. In a sense, it's kind of a bit like what Ayn Rand mentions in Fountainhead about the creators and parasites, and the parasites being only concerned with conquering men, if I remember correctly, something along those lines.
Yeah, the second-hand lives, as it's called, as it's phrased in the Fountainhead.
Second-hand lives, yes. So in this sense, the stockbrokers are just parasites that depend on but the other men are actually producing, and they also end up dominating it, and at their whims they can destroy or uh, rise up raise up the value of what they are producing. I did enjoy a lot of the moments that Charlie Sheen and Michael Douglas have together. Gecko, well, actually, now that I remember, it is fine that we mentioned Ayn Rand due to Gecko's speech at the, I think it was like a convention, stock convention that they had, and how he talks about greed, how greed is good. So I actually like a lot of the Gecko moments. Is very memorable, I'd say.
Yeah, so that actually that speech is based off of a real life speech given by Ivan Boesky that he gave at a UCLA, or sorry, USC conference, and basically almost verbatim was saying the same things. And it turns out that Boesky wound up being caught for insider trading and thrown in prison. So very similar to the what happens to Gecko in this film.
Out of curiosity, was that after or before the film came out?
This was in, I'm looking it up right now, 87.
It's almost the exact same time.
Yeah, 87 is when the film was released, so it could be very close.
Yeah, maybe prescient then, probably given the length of time it takes to make a movie. So yeah, let me quickly comment on the Ayn Rand comparison because yes, Gecko's speech is a little bit reminiscent of something one of her heroes would say, particularly how he rails against the sort of board of directors of the company he's giving the presentation to, which is that's who Rand would truly see as the parasites. And this movie, though, is kind of taking a very opposite stance to her by putting that speech in the mouth of its villain.
Yeah, so I mean, as I had commented on briefly at the beginning, uh, Oliver Stone is definitely one of those directors who, and a quote that I've talked to you guys about before, is George Orwell's quote of "all art is propaganda." That's definitely the
Yes.
case with Oliver Stone. I mean, he kind of wears his political allegiance on his sleeve, and most of his movies tend to have some kind of outwardly critique of either capitalism or American culture in general. That's not to say that necessarily it makes him a bad director or that necessarily I would disagree with any of his views. It's just knowing going into his films, know what you're about to get. And this Wall Street is definitely one of those films, I think, where you kind of know what you're getting when you know it's Oliver Stone. Which actually, a fun fact I forgot to mention in our opening is that originally Oliver Stone was set to direct American Psycho, and Leonardo DiCaprio was supposed to be Patrick Bateman in that film, but then I think DiCaprio wound up walking away to do another film, and I think because of that, Oliver Stone wound up working on this instead.
All right, so I want to comment a little bit about the all art is propaganda line because we've had some I think unnecessary friction over this before, and I think that's because I have a bit of a visceral dislike for it. But that's because I've thought about this more now. I think that's because I want to maintain the word propaganda as a pejorative. I think it's useful to have a word like that at least to refer to a specific kind of like art or fiction that portrays its message in a particular way, and it's difficult to define. But that's when the conveyance of the message comes before what we call artistic concerns. So again, that's really hard to get into what exactly that constitutes. But for example, most people will agree that subtlety is important in art, and the propagandist always sacrifices subtlety completely because his primary purpose is to get people to understand what he's trying to say and then try to agree with it as well. And
I,
that's
I
usually to the detriment of the story, although maybe a little less in this particular case of Wall Street.
I can agree with that, and I think the reason that both myself and maybe Orwell use the term propaganda is we at least want to be consistent in what we're saying. We don't want to kind of excuse something that we may like as not propaganda versus something we dislike as propaganda, whereas on its face value, it is propaganda. And from my point on it, it's not so much that you have to look down on something that has propaganda in it. It's just know that when you're going into this, that's what it's doing, and then you take, you can critique it after the fact. I know because I do know a few friends at least that if I say that, oh, it's critiquing such and such, immediately I'll get the response, oh, well, then, well, that's not a film or piece of art or a book that's worth reading for me then. It's, well, why not? I mean, as long as you know that it's talking about this particular thing, it's all the better.
Yeah, so basically, to clarify perhaps a little bit, almost all art is coming from some kind of ideological or philosophical standpoint, whether that's something directly related to politics or just, sort of a way that it thinks people should live. So any sort of as a heroic, like a hero character, usually the way that hero chooses to act mirrors how the creator thinks people in general should act, for example. But yeah, you can definitely draw a line of distinction between that and, for example, something like a book by Ayn Rand that sits you down and lectures you point by point on everything the author believes and how he should act in the world and so on. And yeah, this also brings up a sort of corollary to something I talked about in a previous episode where I sort of disagreed with people who analyze the story according to how much they like and agree with the characters. Relatedly, there are some people who will kind of instantly dislike a work if it carries a theme that they disagree with. So if they're an ultra hard capitalist and there's something that's kind of like a socialist or communistic sort of story, they will dislike it no matter how well that theme is conveyed. And I want to, I guess, state my opposition to that. Like, for example, one that we talked about before is that I'm kind of like a lower right um, libertarian, but I really like Mother 3, which is pretty much communist.
Well, and I think that's my point I try to make to people is that at the end of the day, I don't particularly care what type of message you're trying to get across. I will still absorb it and digest it and think about it. I'm not going to turn my nose up at something just because it might have something that I disagree with. Because for me, the only way to become a better person and better understanding and better wisdom is to tackle things that you may disagree with, because that's where I think ultimately some kind of truth emerges, is when you're tackling, you have this idea, you're challenged on it, and out of that dialectical struggle, you come out with a more fruitful view on something.
So
Yes.
commenting on that, I tend to have like a preference for villains in films and I appreciate them a lot. And if we comment a bit in these last two movies we're talking about, American Psycho and Wall Street, both of them have both American Psycho is entirely focused on Patrick Bateman, who we can say is very much a villainous character. He's not someone that you will look up to. And same with Gecko, I think is the real start of Wall Street, and he's also someone that I wouldn't necessarily look up to.
Yes.
He has I'd say compared to Bateman at least a bit more qualities that you could take and say that they can be positives. But I agree with Evil Dex that it is. I try to state that perhaps I didn't enjoy a character, but I would say that they're still a good character, like well written. But I really can enjoy them, and I try to separate that as much as I can. Even though still it still comes into what I enjoy watching or not. But I wouldn't say a work of art is bad or like poor only because I couldn't agree or I can't agree with what character or the themes that are being spoken are in the film or whatever kind of medium that we're talking about. So I think it is important, yeah, to make that distinction. In that case, with Gecko, as much as I like Gecko, I wouldn't be willing to buy a company just to strip it out, sell it for parts, and then leap off like a magnate in whatever Caribbean island I can go close by.
Yes. You like the character, but not his morals, so to say.
Indeed.
Mm.
Yeah. So actually, it's funny with this film in particular is it kind of had the ironic opposite effect. Obviously, this film is going about criticizing sort of 80s capitalist culture. And what came out of this film, at least that I'm aware of, are two things. One is actually a style of clothing or style of getting dressed up, so to speak, called in corporate culture the gecko, which is the button down striped shirt with a white collar, suspenders, slick back hair, and this solid color tie that became known as the gecko. And it was because of obviously this film, because that's pretty much what we see him wearing throughout the entirety of the film. It became that popular that business executives started wearing that and calling it that after the fact. And the other thing too is this is a little less I'm a little less sure of this, but the gecko at one point starts quoting Sun Tzu's Art of War and how to approach business. And I know when I went to business school, there was a lot of these machismo type of uh, instructors, and I didn't have any in particular at my university, but sort of these kind of celebrity personalities would tell people, oh, read, if you want to become a better manager, read Art of War, because business is like war, competition is like war. And I think that definitely came from, in part, this film. And so that irony, I think, of Oliver Stone's intent on this film wound up flipping back on its head and kind of
Yeah,
bringing about a culture that was even worse than what had been in the 80s.
that's actually quite a classic problem for creators. One of the great examples of this, Rain can probably help me get the details exactly right, but one of the great examples of this is Don Quixote, actually, where Cervantes is trying to criticize the chivalric values of the time through the character of Don Quixote, who's basically portrayed as a complete madman. But
Mhm.
in practice, it kind of brought about a revitalization of that system of belief because people just found him compelling as a character. And then Cervantes was so frustrated by this that he wrote a second novel, which actually ended up becoming even more popular than the first one.
Yeah, Don Quixote is very much. Uh, I think this also comes up a bit with what we mentioned, I believe, in Harakiri, critique on certain old chivalry values that are end up being outdated. Or Don Quixote very much is a guy that ended up reading a lot of chivalry books, and when he became a madman and thought himself a knight. And in a sense, yeah, it is amusing how you get that kind of a backfire that you want
Yes,
to critique this, but end up revitalizing it or making it.
Yeah, and
yes,
with Don Quixote, there's another layer to it too, because the character of Don Quixote's intention in the book is actually to revitalize the chivalric culture. So he ended up achieving that, but only in real life, not in the context of his own story.
right. It's a case, I think, of doubling back on our discussion earlier about propaganda. It's the case where the people who would find this film to be critiquing, say, their lifestyle to kind of double down and uh, either be more outlandish with it or, in a way, being sort of this ideological kind of response that, oh, well, that's not true capitalism. This is what capitalism is really like. Or to use like chivalry, like, oh, Don Quixote really isn't chivalrous. This is real chivalry. And in a way, it's also, and because of that, I think also tends to recruit kind of new faces to this movement, which I think in the case of the gecko attire, as well as the sort of war mentality of business, helped contribute to as well.
Shit, that reminds me of something that we had discussed in the past, in the podcast, I believe, of what it means to be like a true patriot. So it is similar to that. I feel that what it means to be a true British, true American, and so and
So
so.
like almost like a no true Scotsman would do that. You mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So one aside that's in this film that I forgot, because I had seen this back in college. This was actually a film that my finance instructor, my finance professor, had recommended we all watch. And watching it now, after having seen more movies and kind of knowing my way around, like who actors are and who directors are, didn't realize how many big names were in this movie, especially particularly in the 80s. There's definitely a lot of Blade Runner actors in this. There's a lot of a couple of Brits in this who I recognize. Terrence Stamp being the most obvious one as kind of Gordon Gekko's opposite or antagonist in this. The other two, Sean Young, I completely forgot Sean Young was in this, even though she's only has a very small, minor role and doesn't show up for until like maybe has 10 minutes of screen time, if that. And then Daryl Hannah being the other Blade Runner actress who plays as Bud Fox's love interest, or should I say, maybe several characters' love interests, as we find out in the film.
Yeah, she was actually the one in particular that gave me that tinge of recognition. Like I've seen this person in something before, but I can't remember what it is. And I think it turned out to be Grumpy Old Men, actually, where she's one of the character's daughters, I think.
Yeah, Sean Young was the one when the credits started, and I was like, oh wow, she's in this one too, and I remember the Blade Runner too.
Yes,
So
this was definitely her high point in terms of acting, and then she kind of went really off the deep end, and or not so much she went off the deep end, but I think Hollywood kind of ostracized her, and she wound up stepping away from the industry as a whole.
yeah, I think it also, if we come back like a bit to the characters, Gecko and Terrence Stamp's character, Sir Larry, if I remember correctly.
Yes,
How is
Larry
it?
Waldman.
Yeah, so they Gecko clearly has a feud some resentment with him for something in the past, and he wants to get at him. But if we notice, even though Sir Larry, could also be, let's say, a Gecko, he does take a more, let's say, mature and productive approach to the companies that the stocks he's buying. Even though there is also like an angle for him where something he's gaining. In this case, he is willing to steal the, let's say, the thunder that Gecko wanted to do with the Blue Airlines. So he is willing, in fact, to help Bud in securing the position of the people in there. And he also states at the first time that they meet that he actually wants to the company that is buying to succeed, which is something that Gecko in no moment throughout the film seems to state for any place where he buys stocks. He just really he's really disconnected from anyone and anything.
Yes,
Yeah,
I mean
so
that's
he's a foil to Gecko, to use the like literary term, which is when two characters are pitted against each other to exemplify the contrast between the two of them. And that's the significant part, is that he's willing to invest in some businesses and try to build them up, as opposed to Gecko, whose motives are 100% profit all the time.
Indeed.
I mean, this sort of, I guess, could be the case. I mean, maybe Larry Waldman is someone who used to be like Gecko, but has kind of seen the error of his ways and is trying to amend by doing this. It's kind of ambiguous, at least from my perspective on his motives. But I think as far as Bud is concerned, with the choice he has to make, it's definitely this very prototypical lesser of two evils that he decides to go with. Which actually segues, I want to segue into another point in the film, and this might be, I think, Stone's maybe strongest or most blatant piece of propaganda, if I can continue using that term, is the character Charlie Sheen's character. Or sorry, Martin Sheen's character, Carl Fox, who, for those who don't know, Martin Sheen actually is Charlie Sheen's father. So this kind of father-son thing was very much a real as well as a fictionalized casting. Martin Sheen's character, Carl Fox, is very much this sort of pro blue collar, pro union, working man type of mentality that he kind of is the moral compass in this whole movie. And I think it's very much intended that this sort of viewpoint is the if we want to say the correct view that one should take on having this film. While I do have sympathies with that, particularly this whole, I think Raimi, who had kind of touched upon this idea of people who earn money rather than people who make money. I think that to me was maybe the weakest point of the film because it just seemed so kind of blatantly in your face about what the moral message of the film was, particularly as the three union leaders were all negotiating in Bud's penthouse.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, as you mentioned, the earning versus making, well, in reality, you do need both, and I would say that it could have certainly improved on the perspective of needing someone that is not just on the, let's say, getting down and dirty with the doings and the trade of whatever the business is, but also the ones that put it forward. Coming back to Wine Run, the Fountainhead, there's this mention of the middleman. The middleman is necessary, some characters say, because the middleman is the one that's going to put you out there in the world and the one that people will listen to. Sometimes the artist isn't really known for his art, but somebody recognizes this art and puts it forward and sells it, and that's what really gets them out there. So in that sense, you could talk about that. There are also some other uh, teams been discussed against the middleman in Iron Rand's Fountainhead, but coming back to it, yeah, it could have certainly been improved about that. I feel the resolution also with Bat after he gets arrested and then he's immediately shown talking with Gecko and getting his confession that he put him forward in all of the inside the trading deals could have been improved. As Evil X had mentioned before, it got like a predictable and some of the talks that the paths that this movie was taking could have been executed in a better way. I think at the end it felt like a bit rushed, just like uh, arresting him and then getting him to Gecko and then just going onto the trial. Even if it does end in an ambiguous way, I think that was okay, but that could have been better executed.
Yeah, I think in that case, the film might have been starting to push past its comfort limit in terms of the length of it. And I think that might have been just a decision that was made to kind of wrap everything up quickly before people started drifting off and leaving the theaters.
Yeah, it is a bit of a rushed resolution, and I agree with the criticism of the way the dad character is handled. I think that is a good example of a case where somebody sacrifices the sort of subtlety and complexity of his story in order to fruitfully convey the message that he wants to get across to the detriment of the overall work.
Yeah, to me, that's definitely Oliver Stone at his, I think, worst,
Mhm.
at least in this film.
Yeah, that could have
Yeah,
been improved, and like I think we could have mentioned, or maybe perhaps I missed it at the earlier in the movie when he gets the stroke later on, and then that also like helps hammer down Bud's decision to like come to cat, let's say, and,
Yeah.
and then he's like, oh, this is your second stroke, and then it's like, well, it could have been better to probably mention that before because it just comes up as a bit too melodramatic and right at the moment for him to fix his ways.
Actually, X-Death, I'm kind of skimming through some of the commentary on this as we're talking, and Oliver Stone apparently recommended the screenwriter of the film, Stanley Weiser, to read both The Great Gatsby and Crime and Punishment
okay.
for ideas for the film. So your comparison wasn't totally amiss.
Yeah, there we go. Well, it is quite the classic.
And it's validation for you, as I guess, well, being a Russian or local or resident Russian novel expert.
Yeah, there we go. Oliver Stone's my boy now.
We can't miss on the out on the Russian mention since we're also the prob- probably the biggest Tarkovsky fans podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. Okay, so I would like to go back to the sort of all artist propaganda line for a minute and just bring up that for every rule there is an exception. I think there are a few very rare stories that can be classified as what I call pure art, where there is some kind of intended moral at the end, but it's quite difficult to parse.
And I think I
So,
know who you're going to mention.
oh yeah, I have found one example in recent memory that I think does qualify, and that's actually 12-ounce Mouse from Adult Swim, where I've watched it twice now, and I think it's definitely a case where there's a complex plot and things like that, but it doesn't seem to be in service of any theme. It's just intentionally, it's just a exercise in experimentation with the things you can do in a story and in the medium of animation. And if there is an intended moral in that story, good luck finding it.
Oh, I was wrong. I thought you were going to say Nabokov.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's actually a pretty decent example or a potential example as well.
And at least out of his own mouth, too, he also has commented on that as well.
I think there's a certain class of person who's mostly just interested in the mechanics, sort of art, and will kind of isolate himself from, political interest and things like that to try and focus exclusively in on that. And I have a bit of sympathy with those types of people, and I think, yeah, we probably can identify Nabokov as one of them, and perhaps the creators as 12-ounce Mouse as well.
Well, I was actually expecting you were going to go back and mention the about the consumerism and everything. Go back with custom dance for some reason.
Actually, one thing I too wanted to comment on in this film in particular is there is, at least I picked up on some kind of symbolism in the film, particularly whenever Bud is in his current company, not Gordon Gekko's, not being Gordon Gekko's kind of lackey, but working in his stockbroking company. The one that stood out for me the most is kind of like the wizened old sage who's giving him kind of kind words and advice. Is sort of gave me this very much this like Greek sort of symbolic flashback. I don't know if you guys picked up on that at all. I'm trying to remember who the character's name was.
I remember who you mean. It's basically one of his two superiors. One that
Yes,
that tells
not
that.
the one, not the one who acts like a typical manager and says, "Oh, I always knew you would do great things," and when he gets caught, is, "Oh, I always knew you were trouble." It's like,
Yeah, the other one I know, the one that was with a cane, if I remember correctly.
yes, the one that always kind of took Bud in over his shoulder and kind of was giving him advice.
Mm-hmm.
Small things like that. I noticed there's some kind of symbolism.
Yeah, it's definitely a classic sort of character archetype that guy is working from, of the wise old mentor, and he is I think he's sort of an example of somebody who's willing to put the like greater good, as you might say, or what Oliver Stone considers to be the greater good, above his own personal interests. So he's contrasted against Gecko and his other boss and those people in that way.
One thing I wanted to comment on that I had forgotten. Evil Dex made the the comment earlier that it did make the financial stocks, how they were going to pitch it and sell it, interesting. So I do agree with that. It is something that you wouldn't normally think that, oh yeah, this is very intense to watch, but the sequence especially when towards the end, Bud is doing his strata game to get Silveri to get Blue Airlines. It was, I think, was very nice. And I agree that there are some things that are very hard to make interesting. I go back with a comment that we made on Police Story for Jackie Chan when he's picking up all of the calls. That's something that would normally the way that he executed Jackie Chan in it is amazing, and made the sequence a lot more engaging than it could have been. Just say like, well, it will be a guy picking up phones and mixing up the literally getting entangled in that case between the calls. And in this case, this is something that what I couldn't say that it had the most amazing execution for it. It certainly was very entertaining to watch.
Yes, it did help, and unfortunately, if this type of scene, or if the scene you were talking in particular were to be shot today, it'd probably be even harder to make interesting, just because in today's New York Stock Exchange floor room is very less chaotic than what it was when this film was made. And I think, too, this kind of segues into something I wanted to state, that while this film and our previous discussion film, American Psycho, were kind of paired together as sort of satirical critiques of 80s American capitalism, I think both of them, in particular, maybe this movie more than American Psycho, has aged a bit for the worse for wear, just because of some things that have happened between when the films came out and now. The two in particular I'm thinking of are the Enron scandal in the mid 2000s, and then the 2007 2008 financial crash kind of put the final nail in the coffin that was this sort of culture that both these films were kind of critiquing. And I think maybe if someone wanted a more up to date critique of capitalism, the two movies I would probably recommend are Wolf on Wall Street and The Big Short. I think as being more the more modern pairing to go with today. I don't know whether you guys have seen those and if you can agree or disagree.
No, I haven't seen either, unfortunately.
Same, couldn't really comment on it. I was going to make another comment actually when you say that modern critique. We thought you were going to mention like startup culture and how you can just make your own startup and be your own boss and get up and rolling without ending up perhaps making some mediocre product just because it is quick and fast buck.
Well, if you want satire of that, South Park did a very good job of that.
Oh well, I was going to mention something else like Silicon Valley, HBO Silicon Valley, which I think is
Yeah, well,
pretty good
there's
series.
even the Steve Jobs movie, which was based off of the Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, which kind of demystifies the mythos of some of these kind of up and coming tech junkies.
No,
Uh, because the other thing too, which this film won't critique, is Raim, as you pointed out, this sort of up and coming what is now called the unicorn startup, where
mm-hmm.
they have this company that they can claim they can change the world. And when you start actually digging into their numbers and looking into their finances, they actually are selling a whole lot of nothing, where they don't have any profits, but yet they're still making hands and fists of millions of dollars.
Yeah,
That definitely, I think, would be missing if you're wanting to watch either of these two films we've talked about.
Yeah, Silicon Valley does that actually. It does have some startups that are. To give an example, there's one that they have a pizza app and they deliver pizzas. But what they actually do is like they buy pizzas from another pizza joint and then just repackage them. And they're actually at a loss. They're working at a loss until they get this major investment, I believe.
Yeah.
But it's just like just reselling pizzas. And back to it. Oh man, I forgot. Yeah, but yeah, Star Culture. As you mentioned. Oh, Steve Jobs. Yeah, as you mentioned, I think a good film to watch regarding that demystification of them, and does I think does a very good job of representing both sides. Let's say of the mayor, then Bill Gates and Steve Jobs is Pirates of Silicon Valley. I don't know if any of you have seen it.
I have not now.
If not,
Me neither.
I would recommend it. It's an older film actually. So I think it's from the 90s, and compared to like the Steve Jobs film that there have been made, because there are two I believe now, one with Ashton Kutcher and one with Michael Fassbender. I'd say this is better watch. It's a bit more it's not tilted to a single side. Let's say it's a bit more equivalent on the representation of them, which is better to as I think Wally may agree, as he says that he doesn't like the deification of public figure. So
Yes.
then this is the case of them, I believe.
Well, just real quickly to go back, two other sort of modern companies that have made the news recently that are sort of criticizing this unicorn startup mentality is Theranos and WeWork, both companies which have now completely basically have liquidated, and their founders and executives have kind of been shamed into irrelevancy now.
Tyranno's case is actually very intense considering what they were doing. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
actively mess up human lives. I'd say
Sorry,
in
could you
that
explain
case.
that more? Because I don't know about it.
So I think Tyrannos they did like blood testing, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
Uh,
so I can talk about this a bit. So Theranos basically had claimed, their founder Elizabeth Holmes had claimed that her company was able to basically take blood tests of people, and with the not even so much as a pinprick that like someone who is a normal diabetic is used to taking, but you could, this little tiny, the most minuscule amount of blood. And as the company kept growing and growing and getting more and more money, they kept making more and more claims that this single itty bitty minuscule blood sample could track everything from your chance of getting every type of cancer to whether or not, what type of, other health things you were going to have. And it wound up being a whole huge hoax. And there's a really good documentary that HBO put out, called Out for Blood, um, about this whole company. And Holmes is definitely one of these types of people who is, I think, a case example of an ideologue, someone who just became so into what she was trying to do, so convinced that her product could change the face of the earth, that she refused to back down if there was any kind of criticism, would refuse to believe any kind of things that were happening inside the company that might have jeopardized her mission. Is definitely a good case of both this sort of, as Raim said, this deification of a person, as well as a case study on how ideology works and how it can warp people's realities. And as a general, like I said, a good case on the kind of flaw of these so-called unicorn startups.
Indeed, yeah, Tyrannos is certainly a major case and a good example of a startup doing promoting something that is we could say ethically wrong because
Yes,
they did.
yes, because to go on that point, a bunch of people's health choices were being made based on what their blood samples were coming back, which Theranos also found out during some of these court cases was just kind of making up, which is tying into that ethical consideration. So yes, this is probably, Theranos is probably the biggest modern example. WeWork is more recently come out as kind of being just another real estate broker that fancies itself as this new age uh, corporate,
Co-work.
yeah, co-work cohort type of thing, which wound up falling flat on its face.
Yeah, no, I don't know if we have anything else to say then about Wall Street.
Yeah,
No.
just briefly, this is a movie that examines the theme of egotism and gives sort of the rise and fall of a big egotistic character. That's something that I'm quite interested in and tend to like in movies, so I want to give a couple recommendations of classic films that do similar thing. So just briefly mention Akira, we've talked about that one a lot. Also, Citizen Kane, of course, is the quintessential one.
Mm-hmm.
And Sunset Boulevard is also another really great one that shows the downfall of an aging and now irrelevant egotist.
Yeah,
Right.
I think there's a lot of great examples. I definitely recommend all of them too.
Yeah. So I think, I guess, to kind of wrap this up, as a whole, Wall Street isn't by far my favorite film ever, but I still think it's one that's worth watching, particularly as I had mentioned, if it kind of is paired with American Psycho, because they're both dealing with the same kind of topic. They both, I think, have become a bit dated, as I said before, but I think there's still things to get out of it, and I think there's still both of these films can stand on their own, regardless of all that. So I definitely would recommend taking both this and American Psycho, giving them a shot.
All right, I echo that sentiment.
Same. I mean, I would say that I prefer American Psycho out of the two, but yeah, the two are make a good pair actually. Yeah, just to mention though that American Psycho was released in 2000, so it's been 20 years, and Wall Street has was properly released in the 80s. So
Oh, and don't go watching the sequel to Wall Street. It's not worth it. Want to make sure I say that.
Okay.
All right, so we've been Outside the Wall. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.